My name is Vince Hurley, and I've been a lecturer here for 6 years, and I lecture in strategic geopolitical policing, which means I look at different policing systems around the world. So what's it like to be a police officer in Vietnam, or what was it like being a police officer, say, in the former Soviet Union, and what's it like to be a police officer in, say, Norway. So we look at policing and the political environment in which those police officers work, both historically and at the moment. I also lecture in criminology, and this is what we're going to talk about a bit about what motivates individuals to cause crime. And you'll be pretty surprised to find out there's 6 things, and they're fairly straightforward. Don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the psychology of it or the sociology aspect, but they're pretty straightforward and things that you will identify with that happen maybe at school or even at home. Then I'm going to talk about the Lindt Cafe, because everyone has an opinion about what the police didn't do or should have done. Of course, in hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. So as a former hostage negotiator, I had some close friends who I still keep in contact with, the police, who were there at the day, 2 in particular who were involved in the negotiation process with Man Monis, and a couple of people who were at the forward command, so they were very close to the action, so to speak. So we'll talk about that. But before I start, as you can see here, I was in the police for 30 years, and it's true that I've been shot at. I was shot at twice in my career, once at a domestic argument, and once at a siege near Gundagai. I was stabbed by a woman. Yes, girls, I was stabbed by a girl. Oh, I tell you, it was pretty scary monsters, I don't mind saying. She had a big syringe, not just your normal intravenous syringe, but a big syringe. It was that big, actually. It was huge. And she was sitting down in a seat. We went into their house and she was sitting down on a lounge, and we were executing a search warrant for some drugs, and she's just sitting down calmly, and she just reached down to the side of her lounge and pulled out this massive syringe and gone like that, and I put my hand up to prevent being hit in the face, and she's stabbed me through the pad of my thumb down here, my hand, and it went right through my hand, and then she's twisted the syringe and snapped off the needle in my hand, and then got the remainder of the needle and went like that. So it jagged all the edges around my hand. So yes, girls, oh, savage individuals you are. So yeah. So I've been stabbed. I fell off a 2-storey building and fractured my spine and leg after chasing some baddies out at St Mary's. Baddies, that's a very academic term for offender. And I was hit by a semi-trailer. Bit of a loser, aren't I? Hit by a semi-trailer out near Yass, driving a police car. And he never stopped, unfortunately. Still don't know to this day who it was. And when I was attached to Katoomba, I helped a doctor amputate a man's leg who was it was crushed in a motor vehicle accident. He had a head-on with a semi-trailer, and his leg was all mangled and we couldn't get it out. So they flew in Westpac, waka, and landed on the Bells-Liner Road. And at the time I was in the police rescue squad, and I helped the doctor cut off his leg to get him out alive. So that was interesting to say the least. So there you go. So when people say to me, is being a police officer great? Absolutely. Would love it. Would highly recommend it to anyone. But it's a bit of an unknown beast. So when I was preparing for tonight, or today, I said to my 4 children, some were in high school, some were in primary school, any suggestions? And my oldest daughter said to me that, Dad, don't be a nerd. Don't be an academic nerd. Don't use any big words because they will not be impressed. They'll come away just thinking that you are I can't swear, but you're a nerd. So, fair enough. Then I said to my youngest daughter, what do you think? and she's in primary school, and she said, "Dad, have lots of pictures. We want lots of pictures because you're ugly. And because you're ugly, it will give the students a good distraction by looking at pictures." I said, "Thank you very much, darling. I'll make sure I have lots of pictures." And then I said to my twin sons, who I thought would have been on my side, I said, "What do you think?" And they said, "Dad, don't kid yourself. The only reason that they're watching you is because they've been forced to by their teachers. So they're not there out of interest. They're there because they have to be there." So I thought, well, this is great. So I went to my wife and said, "What do you think?" And she said, "Look, I agree with all the kids." So having said all that, I thought, well, God, it's a bit behind the eight ball to start with. So there we go. So, as you can see there, I was investigating kidnappings and homicide, home invasions. I was an undercover operative, the last stop point, where I was involved in the importation into Australia of cocaine and trafficking of cocaine within Australia. I was involved in the manufacturing of amphetamines, LSD and ecstasy. Investigated child abuse, physical and sexual child abuse, mainly under the age of 10, which was pretty traumatic. So I've had a good experience in the police and loved every minute of it. So, academics, crime fighters, let's have a look and see what we got. So we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at what causes or motivates an individual to cause crime, who are the police, and we're going to look at the Lindt Siege Cafe, as I said. So there are generally 6 reasons why individuals cause crime. And I guarantee you from today, you will hear this repeated in the media, and you won't forget this. The media on TV or in the paper will say, police believe the motive for the crime is X, Y or Z, whatever that may be. The first general motivation or motivating reason for a crime is excitement. This is particularly relevant to arson. Now, when a person or an arsonist lights a fire, and this is mainly relevant towards arson, they sit back and they look at the whole environment of which they caused malicious damage or arson. So they look at the fire and they admire it as their own handiwork. They think that they have created something that in their eyes is just wonderful. And they sit back and they get a gratification from that. They like to see the smoke, they like to see the flames, they like to see the emergency services, the police, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, the Rural Fire Service, the ambulance, all turn up to deal with their creation, their handiwork. So they are like a voyeurism, a voyeuristic intention of looking at a fire. It is their handiwork. They want to sit back and admire it. And invariably, arsonists are somewhere in the crowd looking at the fire. Not all the time, but invariably. So the first reason for people to commit a crime or motivate crime is for excitement. The second reason that people commit crime is lust. Now you can see here, this is from the Herald, that terrible murder at Leeton, where Vincent Stanford murdered that woman who, I think from memory, was not long before she got married. And you can see there that I've got underlined, bride rape, bride kidnapping, bride rape with wedding dresses. Most sexual offences are driven by lust, to the point where it is not a reasonable lust that you and I might have towards an individual, but it is an overwhelming degree of lust or stalking an individual for a specific reason, in this case sexual assault, and it normally is in relation to sexual assault. And when you investigate a crime, particularly a sexual assault or any crime, you need to try and focus in what is it that they're actually looking for. In this case, it was the bride. He targeted a bride. In his case, it was bride lust. So lust is a reason or a motivating reason for a crime. Big Donald, the big T, the big Trumpster, eh? Leader of the free world. God help us. God. What is the motive for his sexual assault? His sexual assault which was disgraceful, is ego or power. Trumpster, because of his own belief that he holds an important image or position in society, being rich, because he's politically powerful, he believes he had the right to go and sexually assault individuals. So his motivating for the sexual assault was purely based on, I am Donald Trump, I'm a billionaire, I'm running for president, I am a powerful individual. So this is more like an authoritarian rule over, or an authoritarian rule over an individual. In other words, this case, the woman being an object. So ego and power is a reason why, or the motivating reason why, the big Trumpster went ahead and did those, generally speaking, those criminal acts. And they are. The fourth reason or motive for crime is anger and hate. The Comancheros, you can see up here, Macquarie, there was a massive argument on fight at the Sydney airport back in 2014, I think it was, with the outlaw motorcycle gangs, be it the Nomads, the Finks, the Odin Warriors, the Coffin Cheaters, the Fourth Reich, the Gypsy Jokers, the Rebels, Bandidos, there's a whole host of them, Lone Wolves. They simply hate each other. That's the only way to describe it. We belong to the Comancheros, and the Comancheros hate the Hells Angels. And that was the only reason for the fight or for the murder. It was based on pure hate. The reason for the hatred was because, if you can see down here and underlined in red, they are rival clubs. That was only the reason, because they just hate each other that much. Something that, of course, you and I really don't really grasp because we're not indoctrinated into their culture. But a good example of this is that when my twin boys pick on one of my two sisters, you hear my daughters, I beg your pardon, yell out, "Dad, Mum, Dad, I'm going to kill him. He's doing this, he's doing that." So that momentary anger or hatred is driven by the fact that their twin brothers are picking on them. And of course, as all boys know, that's boys' jobs in life, is to pick on their daughters. So that help, I hate them, is driven by anger and hate towards their brothers. I'm sure the girls would agree. The next one is revenge. So again, going to the Sydney Telegraph a couple of years ago, you can see there, and it's underlined, revenge killing in the Sydney court, the second underline, motivated by hate and revenge. Go down to the very last line, underlined, he was motivated by revenge, pure and simple. But why was he motivated? Why was this man motivated by revenge? The dotted line tells you because a member of his family he was held to believe the member of his family, someone else was responsible for his death. So the motivating reason for murder was the death of a family member. So when you are a detective or criminologist and you want to try and investigate the crime, you look for the motivating reason. In this case, it was the murder of his brother. Now, two things I want you to remember about looking at a newspaper. There's only two things you believe: the date and the price. Everything else in the paper you question. The date and the price are the only two things you believe in a newspaper. Critically analyse what the paper says. The sixth reason is greed. So you remember there was some schoolmates who were stockbrokers. They were found guilty of insider trading. On 45 occasions, as I've got underlined in red, they gained profit for $1.4 million to support their lavish lifestyle of $3,000 a week apartment in Bondi. So they were greedy. And most baddies or criminals come apart because they want more. And in these individuals, it was 45 separate occasions to fund their lifestyle. And again, a simple example of this at home is that last week I was in the kitchen and the pantry door was closed and I heard this rustle, 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 rustle. I thought, what was that? I opened the pantry door and here's my 8-year-old daughter scoffing her face with Tim Tams. And there was chocolate all over her face, and she couldn't get enough Tim Tams into her mouth. She must have had about 50 in there. And I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "Nothing, Dad." As she spat out all the Tim Tams talking to me. "Nothing, Dad, I'm not doing anything." And I said, "Are you eating chocolate?" "No, Dad, no." But of course she was being greedy. Of course, being a detective, the evidence of the chocolate was all over her face. But her motivating reason, and the result of getting a bellyache, was that because she was greedy. So we know, and this is the last one, that we know that the motivating reasons for crime is lust, anger, revenge, ego, greed and excitement. We'll come back to these if you have any questions in a moment. So, who are the police? First of all, the police. Look at that bloke popping a mono in front of all those police vehicles. Not the smartest tool in the shed. So the word police comes from the ancient Greek word polite or politsia, which means to govern. It's a form of governance, government over the city. There were no police in Athenian times or in ancient Greece time. Every individual, every citizen was responsible for his or her own behaviour and actions in society. Hence the notion of citizen's arrest, even today. So the police look at the internal government or governance of the conduct of the population within a state. New South Wales Police look at the way in which the public in New South Wales behave. Western Australia, Western Australian Police, etc., etc. So the organisation or the police, it's a civil force, it's not a military force, and they police the internal affairs of the state, in this case New South Wales. Whereas the military police the external borders of Australia. Okay, they don't want anyone coming in, but the police look at the internal borders of New South Wales. And as Condoleezza Rice said down here, the military is a special instrument, it's lethal, it's meant to be, it's not a civilian police force. So it's the role of the police to police society. Now, in ancient Athenian times, during the Persian Wars, the Greeks would go out and conquer the land, and they would bring back all these slaves. And this is one of the first recorded forms of policing. They bring back all these slaves, and these 300 Scythian slaves, you can see up here in the corner, blah, 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 look at them, very attractive. They were pretty good slaves, according to the records. And these slaves were given the role by the community of Athens, generally, to go and arrest other bad slaves who escaped from the rich houses. They were given the responsibility of making sure that the streets were clean of litter, making sure that no one was tagging all the buildings, and making sure that the aqueducts were clean and not obstructed with rubbish for purification for water. And over time, because they were so successful at what they did, Aristotle thought to himself, well, this is not bad. I want to get these individuals, these 300 individuals, and we're going to give them a special uniform with a bow and arrow and whip, and they will roam the streets of Athens, making sure that all the individuals behave themselves. And this is one of the very first forms of policing. They had a uniform, they had a weapon, and they were given the responsibility of policing parts of Athens. So initially the word police or politii or polity means government of the city. Their role included keeping the city streets clean, the water clean and hygiene, as well as policing the street for the protection of the individual. So that's one of the first forms of policing. And it's very much replicated today, except I never cleaned toilets when I was in the police. I do clean them at home, but I never did in the police. Okay, so the samurai. So in 910 AD, the emperor, the big E, the big emperor said, I am sick and tired of all these individual countries coming in marauding individuals, raping and pillaging my country. So he said to the feudal landlords, what are you going with the farmers? What are you going to do about this? What are you going to do to help me prevent individuals coming in and raping and pillaging our country? The landlords got together and thought, oh, I'm not quite sure. Then one of them came up with the idea of hiring professional mercenaries. These professional mercenaries were ex-soldiers known as the samurai. So the samurai were given the responsibility by the individual landholders or the farmers in current day, and Blaney would understand this, and Moree, that they were responsible for their specific geographic area, their farm, that they were employed by the feudal landlords or the farmer to protect their property from anyone coming in to that. And they had the ability to inflict punishment, just like I should inflict on Leeton High, no, not really, girls, to inflict punishment on specific individuals, like Illawarra, yes, I'm keeping an eye on you, inflict punishment on individuals if they misbehave, as well as to protect the farmers, the farm workers from marauding masses coming in. And over the centuries, the samurai expanded throughout Japan. And their first job, or one of their first jobs, as a total police force in the year, I think it was about 1000 or something like that, give or take a couple of years, was to collect taxes on behalf of the emperor. So their role was taxation as well as protecting the marauding masses coming in to the land, to Japan. So yes, so that's the feudal landlords and the samurai. They can probably jump backwards up into trees, I really don't know. There you go. Okay, so they were mercenaries. So, I've spoken very briefly about, the bit about policing, etc., etc. Now, a very lonely road for that policeman, very lonely road. So, anyway, we live in a society, a Western democracy, that we are policed by consent. So what I mean by that is this. When Australia was colonised, when New Zealand was colonised, when South Africa was colonised, when we all come under the mother country, England, the supreme ruler, English law was transplanted into Australia, holus bolus. Over the centuries, of course, that law has evolved to take on an Australian perspective. But initially, it was just imported from England. The population never had a say in it because we were convicts. They did what they were told. That notion of policing by consent was introduced into Australia under legislation, under the law of England. That means that as you and I sit here now, whether you're down at the South Coast or, Mount Austin or whatever the case may be, you and I sitting here in our classroom, yes, Leeton, yes, you and I are sitting here in our classroom, and outside in the big wide world, the police are running around and they're arresting someone for an armed hold-up. They're arresting someone for a child sexual assault. They're attending a motor vehicle accident. They're looking for a lost child. They're arresting someone for stealing. They're talking to a mother about her concerns about domestic violence. And you and I are happy to go about our daily business and let the police do that in the background. We are not out on the street protesting about how the police are doing their job. So the fact that we are not out there protesting means that we are consenting by default to the way in which the New South Wales police police. If we did not agree why or how the police were carrying out their business, then we would be like they do in other countries, in say Thailand at the moment, where they're out on the street protesting. When they did in China, they were crushed. So we are being policed by consent. And that consent originates when me and your teachers and you vote. You vote for the politicians, unfortunately, that we hope will represent our views fairly in Parliament and make laws that represent our values. And we accept that. And in turn, they make laws and they give the laws not only to the police, to a lot of different agencies, and the police enact it. So we are, by our vote, by Parliament, by legislation, then by the police themselves, we are allowing the police to police us by consent. If we didn't, as I said, we will be out riding with placards. So, do we always need the consent of the people to police? So we've got the community, which I've spoken about, you and I. We've got the police and the way in which they carry out their job. And we've got the government by laws. But we don't always need the police consent, but we don't always need the consent of you and I to police. The KGB, or the Stasi in East Germany when it existed, or the Gestapo in World War II, they did not have the consent of the bulk of the population to arrest and torture individuals and giving them false imprisonment. There would be no way you and I would agree on the policing tactics of the Gestapo or KGB. So you don't need the consent of the population to police society. You do by policing by consent, but if you don't have the consent of the population, then you have a police state. And a police state today is Vietnam and China, as well as other countries, where the most of the population, in China particularly, or any communist country, they wouldn't be allowed, and they're not allowed to go out and protest and say, there's police corruption, we disagree with this, we want greater human rights. They would crush them like a grape. They don't live in a democracy, so they do not have the ability, because of a one-party state, to be able to manage the state and police by consent. Similarly, in Myanmar and currently in Thailand, where there's a military junta, in other words, it's a number of government, defence and army and air force individuals that police the country. They enforce their rule of law onto a population. So it is, and you'll see this, and this is only fairly recently in Thailand, you'll see this, military junta take place. So in those countries, and you can see big Vladimir Putin down here in his younger days, there he is, when he was a KGB spy, still very unattractive, not wrestling with a bear or anything at this stage. So policing by consent, you need the population's consent. If you don't have it, it is policing a police state. The Lindt Siege Cafe. Right. These are the three most important questions, or the most common questions I get asked by my students. Why wasn't the army called in to resolve the siege? Why didn't the police shoot him through the glass window? And why didn't the police shoot him earlier to avoid him murdering the cafe manager? So, since even before Australia was discovered, as I said earlier, our laws have been transplanted from common law, English law. The police have always had sole responsibility for policing the internal affairs of a state. It is not the role, and it has never been the role within Australia, that the Army, Air Force or Navy come in and take over the domestic affairs of policing society. If we did, that is a police state. We don't live in a police state, excuse me. So the Army, Air Force and Navy keep out the baddies. The police look after the internal affairs of the state. As a military special instrument, blah, 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 it's lethal, it's meant to be. It's not a civilian police force. Secondly, Army, Air Force and Navy, they're trained killers. They are trained to go to war. Yes, you've got humanitarian aspects of it, but they're trained to go to war. So what might be the consequences of the Army, Air Force or Navy, can't really see the Army, or the Navy or the Air Force crashing into the Lindt Cafe, but what would be the consequences if the Army went in there, for example, when their whole mindset is around killing individuals? Hypothetical question, more could have died. So that is why the Army weren't called in. Constitutionally, they're not allowed to do it. But it was interesting to see what happens as a result of the Royal Commission. Not the Royal Commission, the Commission of Inquiry into the Siege Cafe by the coroner. Secondly, why didn't they shoot him through the window? Police believed that he had a backpack and a vest on that had a suicide vest on and a backpack full of explosives. So let's just say, for argument's sake, the police snipers could have shot him. What had happened if he did in fact have a suicide vest on and a bag of explosives? The results could have been catastrophic. Here's a Lindt Siege Cafe in black. Or the purple underlining is Martin Place, the big one running down the middle. You've got the CBA Bank down the bottom. You've got the Reserve Bank down the bottom as well. You've got Macquarie Bank up the top. And you've got the hospital to the right. Depending on the amount of explosives he may have had, and of course hindsight's a wonderful thing, the damage to the population could have been cataclysmic. Secondly, if he had been shot through the window, let's say for argument's sake the bullet was able to penetrate, but just say for that it didn't kill him, but it wounded him, he would have been one angry individual. He could have murdered all of the hostages just like that, even before the police could have got in. So do you run the risk, hypothetically, of trying to take him out before something else happened? Is it an acceptable risk for the police to do that, knowing the consequences might be cataclysmic? Again, in hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. But at the time, the police didn't know. And I'm quite passionate about this, and I'm very defensive of the police, and I can't help but be, being a former negotiator, the consequences just would not have been worth it. Can you imagine if the police had shot him and had a bag full of explosives and it blew up, the buildings around him? It just would have been horrendous to think of the consequences. So why didn't the police shoot him before he possibly shot Tory Johnson, I think it was? No, that was a woman. Anyway, the gentleman, the manager. If police had shot him beforehand, they could have been charged with murder. That's the Crimes Act of 1900 in New South Wales. Section 18 of the Crimes Act relates to murder. Underlined in red, with the intent to kill or inflict grievous bodily harm upon some person or attempt to. Crime punishable by imprisonment of life or for 25 years. Tell me, where is it by law, what gives the police, what gives you or I the legislative ability to shoot someone in anticipation of them committing a crime? I'll be driving down my street. I live out in the western suburbs of Sydney. As a police officer, I say, oh yeah, there's Vince Hurley. Vince Hurley's a baddie. I'm going to pop him off. I have no legal right to do that because I anticipate, excuse me, Vince Hurley might commit a crime. There is no legal justification for the execution of an individual by law in anticipation of them going to commit a crime. And I know it was a hard pill to swallow for the family, but as a good mate of mine said, giving evidence before the coroner, and it grates on me too, despite what Man Monis did, despite what he was, he still had the same human rights and the same legal coverage as you and I had, despite what he had done in the past and what he did. So there was no legal right and no human right to be able to go out and execute someone in anticipation of a crime. If we did that, we'd be living in a police state which unfortunately is being reflected in some parts of America. And I'm sure we don't want to live in some parts of America. So just to finish off before I open up questions. So the motive for crime: lust, excitement, ego, power, revenge, greed and anger. The word police comes from the word polizia or politi, which means a civil government, maintaining law and order, detecting crime within a particular state. We know that the samurai did that in 900 AD or thereabouts, and in the Persian Wars in the Greeks, they took the 300 Scythian slaves in 900 BC, turned them into police for the benefit of the community. We know that there's policing by consent, but you and I all agree to that. You need the community, the police and the government to agree, and we by default are allowing the police to go out and do their business. But if we remove our consent as individuals, we live in a police state which is seen by the SS, the Gestapo, KGB, communist states and under a military junta. And we know that the role of the police in the Lindt Siege Cafe was to look after the internal affairs of the state, because under the Constitution, the army aren't allowed to come in. And even if they did want to pop him off before he committed any more crime, they couldn't, because they could have been charged with murder. So there you go, academics and crime fighters. A career in crime, as in being a baddie or a goodie? My kids have already chosen a career in crime. If I was to give you any general advice, and my students ask me this all the time, and having a previous life before academia has been very valuable because I've got different perspectives that I can pull upon. Ask yourself, when you finish your degree, what is it that you want to do? If you pursue a degree in criminology, say to yourself, in 5 years' time, where do I want to be and what do I want to do with it? Now, you may not know the exact answer, but generally speaking, you might say, well, you know, I want to go and work in a prison, or I want to be a police officer, or I want to work in an NGO, or I want to work with a human rights organisation, or I want to work for the UN. So my advice, and I hope this answers the question, someone from Blaney's got their hand up, I hope that just speak to people in the industry, in their occupation, and ask them. There's good and bad in every job. The police organisation is a bit mysterious, a bit mystique. Most people don't know what goes on. But certainly ask them. In relation to criminology, it's a very narrow field and sometimes can be hard to get a job at the end. It sounds great and exciting, and it is, but it can be really hard to get a job. So look at what you want to be or what you want to do in, say, 3 or 5 years' time. Would I've changed anything? From my point of view, would I've changed anything? To be honest, I don't think I would, and I say that trying to put myself outside of being a former hostage negotiator. Sometimes the longer a siege goes on, the better the result, because it means that the person who you are talking to in the stronghold can be fairly compliant with the directions of the negotiator. So you don't know what negotiations are going on in the background. So the longer it goes on, it can work to the benefit of the negotiators. What really complicates negotiations with a hostage taker is their mental illness, alcohol, drugs, and or three. Because the average individual, and I'm not the average individual, you are, the average individual wouldn't go in to, you know, a school and, you know, hold a whiteboard marker to your teacher's throat, although you probably would like to. But the average individual wouldn't generally do that. But someone who is affected by alcohol and or drugs and or a mental illness, it's hard to rationalise with them. And all you're trying to do is to resolve their issue if it can be resolved. But I don't think I would have done, I don't think I would have done anything else, because as you people know from the rural communities, he could have killed those hostages with his you know, shotgun just like that. And by the time the police got in, it might have triggered that anger or that resentment or that result of more people being murdered. The police sometimes do work experience depending upon local arrangements. You can do work experience. Obviously, you can't do work experience like, getting a big shotgun and kicking in a door and things like that. It can be fairly mundane, but you can do work experience in there. The police have open days, go to that. Unfortunately, with police, because of the dangers associated with unpredictability, it's really hard to be able to find a pathway in. But there are, I'm just trying to think of some. The Police Academy in Goulburn, if you're ever down there, you can go for a walk through there, but it's pretty much, there's no simple way to go into the police. You have to actually do the course to get in. It's not like as if you can go to KPMG or PricewaterhouseCoopers and do a bit of a work experience for 3 or 4 weeks or an internship and then go. Surprisingly, crime has decreased around the world. But do you know what has increased? And I can't see you Canterbury Girls High, unfortunately. Hello, hello. What has actually increased is your perception that crime has increased. So the perception is that the crime has increased. Crime hasn't increased. The media do a very good job of amplifying the deviance or the badness in society that we all think crime has increased. It hasn't increased. It's our own personal perception. Murder is the lowest by far, but because it's such an impact crime, whack you between the eyes, you go, whoa. Probably fraud, online crime, because it's hard to police. What can we do to make society safer? The government can put more money into preventative programs, diversionary programs. I think the data or the stats say that for every $1, and don't quote me on this, even though you're all looking at me and I should know, for every $1 spent on preventative or diversionary program for young offenders and for those who are on the cusp of that, it gives a 7 times return to the state. So it gives an economic return 7 times over. But if you put someone in jail, and I'm not saying jail doesn't have its place, it does, because there are some individuals that are just recalcitrant, sometimes for no fault of their own, that once you put them in that system, they're locked in. I'm not a great fan of, this might come as a surprise, I'm not a great fan of jail. It has its place, absolutely. But this trifecta of tough on law and order, more police and more power and legislation, the police have got all the powers they need. They really don't need any more to do their job. Yes, the law has to stay pace with changes in especially cybercrime, but generally speaking, there are sufficient laws for the police to do their job. You don't necessarily need more laws to be able to police society. Okay, so all the laws in the world and all the money in the world is not necessarily going to make society a better place. Certainly preventative measures and diversionary programs, because you need a lot, because people have got individual problems, subcultures have got individual problems, and the more money you can put into preventative programs, I genuinely believe, the less chance of recidivism. Because you've only got a very small percentage of the offenders causing the bulk of the crime. Okay, so the federal police officer, they only do state policing in Canberra. So what I did in New South Wales, they only do in Canberra, and the population of Canberra is probably not much bigger than Parramatta. It's a very, very small, very narrow territorial footprint in relation to policing as we know it. So they would do accidents, domestic arguments, armed hold-ups, and drug raids and things like that. The bulk of their work would be the external borders, because they are involved in preventing importation of drugs, but that's the most common one. But their role is very, very small in relation to that. So they might be involved in investigating importation of drugs, but the number of people that do that within Australian Federal Police is really, really, really small. You've got more police in New South Wales doing that, investigating of major drug trafficking in New South Wales, which permeates into other states, than you would have in the Australian Federal Police. Australian Federal Police and New South Wales Police work together with other states to police terrorism. So that's also, they would do one of the same there. This Federal Police do a lot of fraud, Commonwealth fraud, ripping off of Centrelink and things like that, which, to be honest, fraud. You'd have to be a pencil head to do fraud. You have to be a nerd like me if you wanted to do fraud. Fraud is not my area or passion. So they do a lot of fraud, a lot of accounting and things like that. They would do immigration crime, like if there was detention centres, but the scope of the Federal Police is quite narrow, even though it's over a vast geographic area. Thank you.